everyone, and thanks for listening to another episode of DIB Innovators. Today I'm speaking with Sasha Seymore, co-founder and president of Ethos. Sasha, thanks for joining today. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me, David. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, well, you have an amazing background for the listeners. Talk me through how you went from a basketball player all the way to starting a very cool company that's working with defense company as well as a lot of other commercial, verticals.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start from the beginning. So I'm originally from New Bern, North Carolina. That's where I was born and raised. I ended up going to the University of North Carolina on an academic scholarship. And while I was there, my senior year, I walked onto the men's basketball team at Chapel Hill. And maybe I can go into like depth, maybe in a different part of this on sort of the experience that I had when I made the basketball team, but basically struggled a little bit with my actual playbook. And my roommate at the time was the student body president at Chapel Hill. And he and I had an idea to basically take a lot of the best practices in training and education that he was learning from his time at student body president and bring them to this highly competitive world of athletic teams. So I've had the idea, we're thinking about it, and I'm toying it back and forth like most entrepreneurs do of like, wouldn't this be cool if we did this? But our paths actually diverged for a little bit. So right after I graduated, I won a Mitchell Fellowship to go study in Northern Ireland. And I also played a year of professional basketball and then spent 2 years working for McKinsey & Company. My co-founder, Andrew, went to go work for the African Leadership University and basically started a set of tertiary universities in sub-Saharan Africa. And then he and I both got into business school at Stanford at the same time. And when I did, I ended up winning a scholarship called the Knight Hennessy Fellowship, which is basically started by Phil Knight. He essentially dropped $400 million to create almost what he would call like the roads to Stanford, so a fully funded graduate education there. Awesome. And I think like most folks in post-graduation was really trying to figure out what it is that I wanted to do. Where did I want to make an impact on the world? What was the things that really mattered to me? And how was I going to sort of change the world in a cool and interesting way? And I remember when I won the scholarship, I got a chance to actually meet Phil Knight. And he gave me a signed copy of his book, Shoe Dog. And I was reading through Shoe Dog, and there were basically two pieces to it that really stuck out to me. One was one portion where he's an accountant. I think he's right around my age. He's like 25, 26 at the time, what age I was at the time. And he is sort of in his room doing accounting stuff. And one of his bosses comes by and he's like, Phil, like, you're doing a great job. Like, maybe one day you can be an amazing accountant. And I was sitting there as like a second year analyst at McKinsey. And I kind of like was doing an Excel model at the same time and kind of just like stared at the wall and was like, wait, is that my life too? Like, if I really crush it, can I be an amazing McKinsey consultant one day? Like
someday.
Yeah, this didn't feel like what life had been promised or like what I had been visioning for what life would be. I remember there was a second part of the book as well too, where Phil, he had been an athlete at Oregon. He'd run track. And in it, he is thinking about what he wants to do with his life. And he goes for a run. And as he's running, he's thinking to himself, man, I don't exactly know what I want to do, but I want it to feel like I'm an athlete again. Like I want it to feel like I don't know whether I'm going to win or I'm going to lose, but like I'm putting it all on the line and I'm out there competing. And I remember reading that line and thinking and just feeling something very similar. Like, I don't know what I want my career to look like, but I want to feel like a basketball player again. And so in that moment, Andrew and I basically called each other up and we're like, hey, we're both going to Stanford. I've got this Knight Hennessy Fellowship. Let's quit our jobs and actually go do the thing that we've been talking about for years, this sort of like playbook learning platform. And that was kind of the start of Learn to Win, which is now Ethos. And so Andrew and I started that when we were in graduate school at Stanford, ended up raising our seed round right after we graduated, have since raised about $34 million and are still building the company with my college roommate.
Yeah, that is fantastic. Well, a lot to unpack there before we get into the company. I got to know, so how in the hell did you walk? You're a senior in college and you decide to walk onto the basketball team? I mean, come on.
Yeah, another kind of fun story there. So in high school, I was actually mostly a soccer player. My grandfather, who played just a tremendous role in my life, had been an All-American back in the 50s. And so I'd grown up with soccer as my sport. And then while in high school, I ended up growing another 6 inches, 7 inches. So I went from being sort of a quick, fast center midfielder to being a very gangly and awkward center midfielder. But the cool perk about growing 7 inches, you get a lot better at basketball. And so I ended up, I had offers to play at smaller schools that weren't North Carolina, but ended up taking, especially it's a scholarship called the Morehead Cane. And so I took the Morehead Cane to Carolina thinking that I would just be a regular student. And then my maybe first month on campus, my dad sent me an article to this thing called the Junior Varsity Basketball Team. And it's a program that Carolina has had for the past 50-ish years or so, where basically in the 70s, freshmen weren't eligible to play Division I basketball. So everybody had a freshman team and then a varsity team. And then when freshmen did become eligible, everybody got rid of that freshman team with the exception of Dean Smith, because Dean Smith just loved the idea that anyone could come to North Carolina and then maybe one day play for the basketball team. And so he decided he would basically draw his walk-ons from that JV program, and his assistant coaches would get experience coaching through coaching the JV team. So every Carolina coach you've heard of, Roy Williams, Hubert Davis. When I was on the JV team, I was coached by Steve McGrath, who coached at UNC Wilmington, and Jared Hass, who then later coached at Stanford, sort of got their coaching chops through coaching that JV team. And so my dad sent me an article to it, and I was like, this is wild, no way. So I went and I tried out, and I remember just walking out on the court for the first time, and Michael Jordan's jersey was hanging in the rafters, and I was like, this is just amazing. And then I played that first season, and I'll be candid, I wasn't very good. I mean, I was a soccer player who was playing basketball. And so I averaged maybe like 2 or 3 points a game and then like 2 or 3 rebounds. And then at the end of the season, Coach Hass, who then later went on to become the head coach at Stanford, sat me down and was like, hey, Sasha, like, you have everything that we're looking for in a varsity walk-on. You've got the height, you've got the grades, you've got the character, you've got the work ethic. Like, you just got to be good at basketball. And so like, it's just like, you just got to learn how to hoop. And so I spent probably, I mean, just imagine like, I don't know who, I see a Broncos hat in the background. Like imagine the head coach of the Broncos comes up to you and he's like, hey, if you just put in the time, like we got a spot for you. You can come play for the Broncos. Like, that's just like, I mean, you tell that to a 19-year-old. So, I mean, I hooped. Came back the next year, I averaged, I think 21, maybe 22 points, 11 rebounds. And then basically on the JV team, you get 2 years to play on the JV team, and then you either move up or you move on. I came back my junior year. They told us like, hey, no spots available this year. Basically nobody graduated. And so I basically spent that entire junior year just by myself. I mean, I played on the club team. I'd go run stadiums by myself. Actually that summer ended up interning for McKinsey. And so I was doing like the 70-hour McKinsey weeks combined with waking up at 4 a.m. and running stadiums and all the stuff that comes with it. And about halfway through that summer, I got a call from one of the assistant coaches at North Carolina, and he was like, hey, we're gonna be pulling up 4 guys who we want to practice with us. Can you make it? And I talked to my boss at McKinsey, and fortunately he had been a North Carolina alum. So he was like, get out the door, like, go, you got an offer, leave. So I left. They took us for about 4 months. And then at the end of those 4 months, I remember Coach Williams walking in and congratulating me and Justin Coleman as the 2 new members of the Carolina varsity basketball team, which I think for me, that was obviously like a really cool life experience as somebody who had grown up a North Carolina basketball fan. But I think probably the coolest part was then walking out afterwards and getting a chance to call my dad, who had taken me to, I don't know how many North Carolina games growing up. There's actually my background over there's a little hat that's got actually my name in it that I used to wear backwards to Carolina games that my dad had taken me with, or like after that moment calling my grandpa, who had taken me on 7,000 different AAU games and soccer games and all of those sorts of things. And I mean, flew to the Bahamas to watch me play for 30 seconds. And that experience of being able to say like, hey, like we are going to play basketball for the Tar Heels was just a really special moment.
Wow. How did it go? Like, who'd you play with? Did you get much time or?
Yeah, I played in 6 games, and then, gosh, it would have been maybe right before the Christmas break. We were actually playing UAB, so the University of Alabama Birmingham, which is at that point coached by Coach Hass, who had been the guy said, I think you could actually do this. got the ball at the top of the key. I remember Jackson came and set me a screen. I drove to the bucket, jump stopped and tore my ACL. And I think in some ways, it was a tremendous bummer, obviously. My stepbrother is a longer story. My mother passed away when I was young, and my dad remarried. I've got a stepbrother who's the exact same age and was a walk-on at Virginia Tech. And we were about to play Virginia Tech, and there was the chance that I might be able to play and actually guard my stepbrother in an ACC basketball game. Which, I mean, I would have absolutely locked him down. Like he had no
Crushed him.
I would have crushed him. And so in some ways, he dodged a bullet, because I would have held that over him for the rest of his life. But then, I mean, another one, senior night that year was against Duke. So like I was going to be starting senior night against Duke. And so in some ways it was really sad because I didn't get a chance to have some of those experiences. But in many other ways, I think there's a million kids across the state of North Carolina and maybe across the country that dream of playing for a place like North Carolina. And for me to have certainly I worked very hard for the opportunity, but to have that experience open up as something for me, I was just so fortunate. And so even if I didn't get to play for very long, I think that one, just the experience of being able to wear the jersey, to be able to say that I played for the Tar Heels, and then the sort of feeling of, I don't know, maybe the journey itself of like what I learned along the way. And even what I learned is and for as brief a period of time as I was on the team, just getting to sit there and watch like how these coaches coached, how they ran their programs, how they coached their teams, how they treated their players. Those are life experiences that I've been able to take with me since then. You couldn't pay money for something like that.
Yeah, a little microcosm of leadership at its finest.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, that is pretty amazing. So you came up then with this idea of taking training that you learned through this process, through playbooks, different things. Talking a little bit about how you saw this opportunity. A lot of people may not even know. I didn't know that basketball had playbooks other than like 3 plays.
Yeah, well, I think it's funny because when we actually built the platform, it was much more applicable for football programs than it was basketball teams. But I'll tell you that the problem in and of itself, how we solved it, and then where it led to. So I had, like I mentioned before, walked onto the basketball team. I had, if you remember the story, played 2 years on the JV team, had a full year off, and then I made the varsity team. And so they're running plays, and nobody has stopped to explain to me what those plays are. Because the last time that I played organized basketball was like a year and a half ago. And so all the plays that the JV team runs are the same as the varsity teams, but I don't know them. And coach just sort of assumes that I know them because everybody else does. And so I go to one of our assistants and I'm like, hey, I'm really struggling with this. Do I think I could get some help with it? And he's like, yeah, I got you. And he goes back to one of his rooms and he prints off this sort of copy of our playbook, which has all of these handwritten plays in it and one of them actually had Dean Smith's signature in the bottom right-hand corner, which again, as an lifelong North Carolina basketball fan, was the coolest thing in the world. But also holy cow, I really felt like we could do this differently. And so I ended up taking that playbook back to my dorm room. And while I was there, my roommate at the time, Andrew, was the student body president at Carolina. And while he was student body president, he was really focused on how the university holistically could improve learning outcomes for students. So there's a lot of research on basically how people learn. And the sort of standard model for university systems is called this passive learning model, where I, the professor, will get up, I'll talk for an hour, maybe an hour and a half. You will take down notes, and then 3 weeks later, you'll take an exam on it. And having gone through a university education system, I can attest, I think most people can say, you probably didn't learn that much during the actual lecture itself. You probably got 5 minutes in, and then you kind of dozed, or you were just sort of frantically writing down notes, and you didn't actually learn it then. You learned it when you got out of the classroom and you started practicing it, where you would write it down and you'd do quizzes and you'd review it and you'd talk about it with your friends. And that process of learning is actually called active learning. And if you start to take those principles and you incorporate them into the actual lecture itself, where you might do 5 minutes of actual information that's being transmitted, and then you'll do a couple minutes of sort of reviewing with friends, or you'll get a quiz question on, you'll have to actually practice the thing that you learned. And then you take that information and you give that data back to the instructor, who can then say, okay, well, I'm noticing this is what people are getting right. This is what people are getting wrong. This is the gaps in what they're getting correct and incorrect. And I can then adjust my training accordingly. The outcomes for the students themselves at the end are dramatically better. I mean, we're talking like 40%, 50% improvement in terms of overall student outcomes. So Andrew and I basically said, well, we know that we have these principles of education that are tested, that work, that are research backed. And we know that we have this very high performing athletic program, this men's basketball team that is studying and teaching their playbooks through sort of physical binders. What if we could basically create a software platform that would basically take those principles in education and actually apply them to these high performance learning situations? And so that's ultimately the kind of genesis of the idea. We thought about basketball programs originally because that's where I had the experience, but particularly realized that like most programs are not a walk-on who hadn't played basketball for the year before, and basketball teams only have like 5 players to begin with, and are generally like smarter than me. And so what we really found was that it was actually football programs where we were seeing real traction and real growth. And so that was our actual first initial market, was the football programs like Michigan football when they won the national championship, or the LA Rams when they won the Super Bowl. That was kind of our initial customers.
You think Michigan won because of your playbook or because of the sign stealing?
I mean, as somebody who loves sports, to be able to, I mean, we can't see obviously what's in there, but we could see the usage data to know that they were using it like 3 hours before game time to memorize and learn different tips.
So give me just a quick overview, like you take their playbook, or like, what does it look like? How did you create the platform to do what it's doing? And what is it in that context? What does it look like? If that's a use case that's easy to talk about. And then I want to ask you, how does that transition to the defense side?
Yeah. So you can think about our platform in kind of 3 different ways. There's the first side, which is the authoring side, which originally started as basically just a tool to make it very easy for anyone who may not have had sort of a background in learning pedagogy to build and create really excellent lessons. And so it was a manual platform at first. Now we've incorporated AI through it. So you could take your physical playbook or your binder, or even material that's in the brain of a subject matter expert that they just talk into our system, and it will basically build and transcribe what I would call essentially active learning lessons. And so the concept of active learning I went through already, but probably the closest experience you might have had to them is like a Rosetta Stone or a Duolingo lesson, where you might get served a little bit of information and then you might get a little quiz question or a thing that would really force you to interact and engage with the material that you have already seen. And then on the back end of that, we're collecting all the data on what people are getting right and what they're getting wrong. And as we're collecting that data, we're basically taking it back into the platform to basically build these readiness dashboards. So your overall sort of coach can see, okay, as I'm looking at my team, I'm seeing, here's the things they're getting right, here's the gaps in what they're getting wrong, here's the overall places where I need to change and improve my practices, so that we are covering the gaps before they actually hit the field, and I know that they actually know the things that are happening. And one of the things that we observed when we started working with these football programs that we then carried on to the military, that we then have carried on to our corporate partners, is this really interesting process where, and we didn't think of this, we just watched our customers and how they used it, is they would actually start with the end in mind. So they'd say, okay, well, we want to score this many points, or we want to run these particular plays. And then they'd go back to like, okay, so what are the things that our team needs to know? And what are the things that our players need to know to make sure that we can actually execute on these things? And then they say, okay, well, these are the things and these are the drivers of what the outcomes are. Now let's measure whether or not they actually know this information. We'll do it through our platform, or basically a quick quiz or a thing where they have to work through whatever it is that they're asked to do, run a route and video themselves doing it. And then once they know that, let's see where they're at, and then really, really drill on those gaps in the knowledge until they've got it perfect. And then let's sort of continuously repeat that process so that we are consistently spending the really valuable practice time that we have on the things that are going to most move the needle in games themselves. And it was really interesting to watch sort of football teams do that. And then we sort of gave it to these teams in the military and they were doing it. And there's sort of, we've dubbed it as kind of the overarching process for how our platform now works and how we work with partners and customers. And now we're starting to build some of the underlying technology to actually facilitate that process within the customers themselves. So it's been a really cool, like fun sort of process to watch.
Yeah, good iterational development. That is awesome. So you started with football, you go over to military. What do you think is kind of that common thread between, if you look at like peak athletic performance and how folks like that learn, and then combat readiness?
Yeah. Well, first, should I talk through like how we got into military, or should I just...
Oh yeah, no, that the perfect.
So I think maybe this also involves a little bit of maybe like some family background and history. So my father's side, we're all from Eastern North Carolina. That's where I grew up. On my mother's side, we're actually Ukrainian. And my great grandfather was a Ukrainian Cossack, which, if you're not familiar with it, they're basically these like horse riding warriors, very similar to a Japanese samurai. As you think of samurais as like the ancient guardians of Japan, like Cossacks were the ancient guardians of Ukraine. He's actually rode his horse into battle, got shot, basically fighting for Ukrainian freedom. He ended up in a prisoner of war camp, eventually made it to Poland. My grandfather was born in pre-World War II Poland, but then lived under Nazi occupation for about 3 years. His family then had to flee during World War II and made it to the US. And this was the grandfather who was then an All-American soccer player. And after my mother died when I was young, basically was the grandfather who took me to every soccer game and basketball game and flew to the Bahamas to watch me play for 32 seconds. And so I think, so that was my mother's side of the family. On my father's side of the family, I had a grandfather who was a U.S. Marine, and I didn't ever actually get to meet him, but we had basically his flag. He died when my dad was quite young, in our living room. And I think through both of those, I essentially just got this real like feeling and sense that like I wanted to be involved in something that was bigger than myself. Like I wanted to serve in some sort of capacity. And so while I was at McKinsey, so the 2 years I was consulting there, I found out that they had a program called the Direct Commissioning Officer Program, where essentially they would take folks who have a particular background or particular skill set and give them a direct commission to do intelligence work for the Navy. And so I essentially signed up for that program, and that was how kind of initially we made the connection between these athletic training programs and then these sports training programs, because I could see basically how these two were connected and all the different similarities between the two and how they trained.
That's right. And I forgot. So you're still in the military, correct? Or
Yeah, I'm a reservist for the Defense Innovation Unit.
which is awesome for your company. Like just the alignment between, so like perspective in the military. Yeah. And can you talk kind of what you saw, just the programs they're running were aligned?
Maybe I'll jump into that for a little bit. I think there's a little bit of the story of my family and my family background. And in a lot of ways, I think that was why I decided to join. But now that I am a member of the a reservist for the Navy, in a lot of ways, it was incredibly valuable. I mean, in some ways, like when I put the sort of reservist hat on, I take the like tech founder hat off. And when I put the tech founder hat on, I like take the reservist hat off. And you have to be very careful about when you're being one versus when you're being the other. But in a lot of ways, like the experience of being a reserve officer has just given me that like fundamental piece of customer empathy. Like I think in most organizations, whether you're working with football teams, or you're working with the military, or working with pharma customers, you have to be able to speak how your customer speaks and understand what they're saying. And I couldn't have told you anything about the Navy in terms of background, culture, how they communicate, what the big problems are before I'd actually joined. And now I feel like I can communicate. I think that's one piece of it. I think the second piece of it is it just gives you an understanding of what are the actual problems that these organizations are facing. And I think one of the things that's been beneficial for me is it gives you both the opportunity to observe those problems, but then also, because I'm a reservist and a lot of my career has been outside of the actual military itself, I think I have a pretty good perspective on what are ways that we could go fix them. And so I'll give an example. I remember I was going through NIOBIC, which is basically our Naval Intelligence Officer basic training. And as I was going through it, I remember the first couple courses, the professor, the instructor got up and he basically popped up this like, I don't know, it was like a 1990s looking CBT thing. And it had like a big picture of Osama bin Laden. And it was like, this is the greatest threat to America. And I want to say this was like 2020, like maybe 2021, AKA like Osama bin Laden had been dead for 10 years. And he was like, don't like pay any attention to any of the learning material that I'm actually sharing with you. It was built by some like clunky old non-functional software system that I can't actually change and it's 10 years out of date. Like, here's the actual curriculum we're going to be studying. And I think for me, there was this both realization of like, holy cow, we have, I mean, the greatest and most advanced military in the history of the planet. We're also training and learning with these like 1980s DMV systems. And it's dramatically holding back the performance of the folks that are involved here. And it doesn't have to be that way because I have built a technology that is better than what we are currently learning on. And that would dramatically improve both the speed at which folks could learn, but as well as their just own experience of working within the Navy itself. And so I think that sort of dual hatted aspect of both being able to speak the language and understand what's going on, but then also be able to say like, hey, I can actually bring solutions from the outside world that I think can really help has been probably the biggest benefit. And I think, I mean, when we talk a little bit about like our own company and how we think about how we hire and recruit, we actually try to bring a diverse set of perspectives for that very reason. We need folks on our military teams who have lived the life, who understand the world, who understand the organizations, who can understand the groups that we work with. But we also want really excellent technologists and leaders who can bring private sector perspectives on how we actually solve these problems.
That's awesome. So how did you then make that first bridge into your first military contract? You hear, the Valley of Death of getting, you've got SBIR grants, and that's one path, OTA, all these different acquisitions. So tying the idea, there's a need, you've got a solution. You kind of know on both sides. How'd you cross that bridge, and where are you kind of in contractual land of, are you program a record yet? For who? Like, who was your first tag? Just talk me through that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I get folks who ask me for advice on this all the time of like, how would you go about doing this again? And quite candidly, like without Stanford, I have no idea how I would do it. And so I think that's a major problem that we need to fix as a country and as a sort of procurement organization. But I'll give essentially the story. So I joined the reserves, had this experience going through my initial reserve training, had kind of just this feeling of like, man, we could really improve the way that this is done. And this is a much sort of, I love sports, but almost like bigger opportunity that we could go capture as a company and as a team. But neither me nor my co-founder really knew how you would actually go work with the Department of Defense. It's like, you just call a general, you just like send them a text, like, I've got a thing that's better here. How does this actually work? And so Andrew and I ended up finding a class at Stanford called Hacking for Defense that's taught by some of the like leading folks in defense innovation. So Steve Blank, Pete Newell, Joe Felter, that crew. And basically the way the class is designed is they take essentially problems that the Department of Defense faces and they give them to Stanford students to go solve. And so Andrew and I already had this sort of hypothesis that we could work with the Department of Defense. We also had a fully functional technology that we could go test and iterate. We were also still in graduate school at Stanford. So Andrew and I took this class and through it got paired with a group from the Air Combat Command. And with them basically ended up taking our pre-existing technology and taking a lot of learnings and best practices that we had from these football teams and essentially applying them to military training. Coming out of that class, we won a directive phase to SBIR through AFWorks. And then 6 months later, some of the folks who had been working on our team while we were in the class had actually worked on the Fitzgerald-McCain collision. And they were like, hey, your technology and what you're building could have made a difference, potentially, in that Fitzgerald-McCain collision, given all of, if you're going to work it back, like all of the different training mishaps that happened on their way to actually these two things colliding and costing lives and millions of dollars. I think that there's a world where this could be really impactful for the Navy as well, too. And so we then won a directive phase 2 SBIR with Naval. And then through those two programs, just able to start basically finding folks within the military and meeting folks within the Department of Defense, and then was able to win our first, basically, like SBIR Phase 3. And then from that point on, we've only done, I think we've done like 20, 25 SBIR Director Phase 3 contracts.
Are you program of record yet, or?
No, not officially a program of record, but we're trending in that direction.
That's great. Yeah, that hack report sounds pretty cool. I helped out with a group at CSU, Colorado State University, who modeled that and brought it over.
Yeah, I mean, candidly, like Andrew and I would not have been able to figure out how to bring our technology to the warfighters without H4D. And I mean, at this point, I think we've got about 25 different groups across Air Force, Space Force, Navy, and Marine Corps that we work with. Our technology at this point is accredited to do training up to impact level 6. So we can do secret level training on the platform. I don't remember the exact number of sort of sailors and soldiers that we've rolled out to at this point, but it's in the tens of thousands. And I think we can point towards like real credible, phenomenal use cases where we have saved the Department of Defense time, money, potentially even lives through the training that we've been able to roll out. And like, again, we would not have ever been able to take that technology to the Department of Defense had it not been for H4D. And so in some ways, it's a good program for us for sure, but it's also, I think, a good program for just the country holistically. And the more that we can build these sort of connections between sort of private sector industry and solutions that they bring and the Department of Defense, I think is just good for Americans.
Absolutely. Yeah, 'cause commercial growth and technology is outpacing the military's capability to do that in-house massively. Well, it's good to hear that actually there was a higher education learning system, that there was value provided. There's lots of shame on that, but that's great to hear.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite customer stories. So we have a partnership with a couple of the Air Force's schoolhouses, so folks who actually go through the initial training process. And prior to us, they were going through schoolhouses in the same way that I went through a schoolhouse, which is lecturer gets up, talks for an hour and a half, and then you go back and you basically take an exam a month or so later. And essentially what we did was we took our AI tooling at that point, took all of their curriculum within a matter of a couple of days, had basically transitioned all of it into our platform. Students could get through it in this sort of active learning process, but then the instructors get data on, okay, here's what my students are learning, here's what they're not learning, here's the gaps, and they're able to fix those gaps prior to the actual exam itself. And so when the exam comes around, instead of having a 50% failure rate, we've cut that exam failure rate by 2/3 because they've already corrected all the mistakes along the way. And then what that leads to is then instead of folks failing that class, having to repeat part of it or just drop out of it entirely, they're actually getting folks through who are qualified to know what they're doing. And I think in that one schoolhouse, we saved over $2.5 million in our first year of implementation. And like, that's at one. And so I think it's one where it's very just like, to go from being a thing that where you're like, hey, this was an idea in the brain of me and my college roommate, and to watch it impact soldiers and sailors in that way is just, it's awesome.
I mean, there are so many schoolhouses in the military. I'm just saying from my Air Force career, from, basic, I went to the Air Force Academy, that whole process, but then you've got, your intermediate, development education, ACSC, National War College. You went to both of those and like how those could apply. But then you look at flying F-15s. I take a 2-year break. I come back and fly F-15s. I go through the same training again. It's the same, even though the jets change, everything's changed. So where are you finding the most traction? Like what type of training courses within, the military are really buying into this?
Yeah. I mean, one of the cool things about the technology that we've built is we can really be applicable across the entire life cycle of training, from the moment that somebody goes in and they enter a schoolhouse to all of the things that they need to learn along the way as they train on different weapon systems, as they switch rates, as they switch units. It's all applicable. And so we have use cases across the board, from maintenance to schoolhouses to flying systems to et cetera. But if I had to characterize them in kind of two major buckets, I'd say the first one has been in schoolhouse training, which is one I basically talked to you before. Somebody comes in and how do we reduce the failure rate? How do we get folks up to speed faster? How do we make sure that there aren't folks who are failing out of these schoolhouses? And how do we save the Department of Defense time, effort, energy, recruits, and train better people through improving the actual schoolhouse experience? The second piece that we've seen is actually very similar to the way that our football teams and our our football teams are using it, which is what I'll call the kind of operational readiness use case, which that can be everything from maintenance to fire squadrons to anybody who has to be sort of ready and prepared for their role. And that goes basically back to the use case that we were describing from before, is you kind of go to a particular performance unit, you say, okay, what are the things that matter for you guys to do your jobs well? How do you measure that? Let's find those things that actually move the needle. Let's sort of test your team on what's their actual knowledge of those things. And then let's very quickly build and create training that addresses those gaps in knowledge that then moves the actual needle for performance. And again, we've got examples across 10 different places for that.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, and I just think, there are so many opportunities out there for airlines, their training. Usually there's, how do you keep focus? Like, where do you put your focus, for level of effort so you don't get just splattered everywhere?
We are a dual use platform. So probably about 70% of the work that we do today is with the Department of Defense, but then we've got another 30% that's actually large life sciences and biopharmaceutical companies. It's manufacturing companies. It's actually, we've done a ton of work in retail and hospitality. At this point, sports is actually one of our smaller verticals, not necessarily because sports isn't still using the platform and loving it, but because our other ones have just grown, which is great. But I think that ultimate question then comes down to like, okay, so from a product roadmap perspective, how do you prioritize the use cases that span from professional football teams to U.S. Air Force schoolhouses to sort of large life sciences and biopharmaceutical companies? And I think for us, where we have really honed in on who are we as a company and where do we want to perform, it's in those critical areas, those critical knowledge areas that matter for performance of an organization. And so you have a lot of these learning tools that will present the information and maybe track whether or not you've done it, but we view those as more so like compliance tools. They're not readiness tools. They're not things that are there to make sure that you actually know how to do your job really well. And so when we think about what are the things that we build, obviously we're kind of going through our different use cases and we're pulling out the use cases that sort of have similar combinations between all of them. But at the end of the day, it's like, how do you make sure that somebody is prepared to do their job right in the moment? And so for us, it's like, well, how do we build and create the training very quickly that's relevant for the task at hand? How do we design training such that we are the fastest way for you to learn something via not a PowerPoint page, not a book that you read, not a podcast? Like, we are the fastest way to do it. And we are incorporating all the best principles in learning science to help. That there's a term in kind of the learning and training world called Bloom's Two Sigma problem, which is essentially when you're training someone, a sort of individual tutor is going to be 2 standard deviations above and better than sort of a regular instructor giving that instruction. And most learning platforms are kind of in that range of like slightly better, but not as good as a personalized tutor. Can we use AI and all the things in it to give us as far as possible along that spectrum so that we can train people faster? And then how do we arm the folks that we work with the best data possible so they have an understanding of what their teams know and what they don't know prior to some sort of catastrophist disaster or something along those lines? And so again, you're right, there's different ways where you can get distracted based on like your football coach wants you to build an integration with Huddle, which is like the video platform, or I don't know, your Air Force schoolhouse needs you to build an integration with this particular LMS that's unique to the Air Force. But I think where we have tried to be really principled in our product development is around making sure that our identity is that platform designed to improve performance for training and learning on things that matter and building things that work for that, which then it can apply to lots of different places.
Oh, that's great perspective. Well, man, this is great. I could keep going on. Let's just do one more question. But, what excites you the most about leading Ethos, and where do you see yourselves in 5 years?
There's so many things that excite me about leading Ethos. I think you kind of heard a little bit of the journey, but I'm built a company with my college roommate and we're still crushing and kicking butt today. I think that there's a lot of things that I'm really fortunate to even be in a position like this. But when I think about the opportunity for us in the future, I see it across both commercial customers, our private sector customers, as well as our Department of Defense customers. But within the Department of Defense, there is this really compelling opportunity today that gets me very excited. I think if you looked 5 years ago, people were calling us crazy for pursuing the Department of Defense as a market. It's too slow. It's going to kill you, blah, blah, blah. And you've seen this shift over the past maybe 2 to 5 years as people have recognized like the vast geopolitical threat that China faces, the fact that we have not innovated in the Department of Defense in the way that we need to, and that this is a thing that is worthy of investing in and worthy of putting time, effort, and energy. And so you're starting to see tons of venture capital that's flowing into the defense sector, but you're also seeing ways that they purchase start to shift as well too. And I think there's incredible opportunity for us, one, to become that sort of overarching training and readiness platform for the military. Like there is nobody else doing it to the capability or quality level that we are. And then the second big opportunity I see is as all of these new hardware systems and software systems are coming into the Department of Defense, you're getting these soldiers who are still the heart and soul of the military and will always be the heart and soul of the military with all of these new weapon systems that they don't know how to use. And where we have seen like such an exciting uptick in our technology is around basically saying, okay, I'm a new soldier. I've been given all this new hardware. I've been all these new systems. I'm going to learn it very quickly. There's no other way that somebody can learn how to do that at the speed that they need to be able to keep up with the rate of how quickly technology is advancing without a system like ours. And so there's this like piece of it where right now we're doing it through really rapid content development based on these new weapon systems that are rolled out, and then readiness dashboards to ensure that we know who's learning things in the right way in the right time. But where we can go with it is like, 5 years, 10 years, you're getting to the point where a new weapon system rolls out and essentially you've got Master Chief who's basically just like bumping it and like initially just going it directly into their heads. So anyway, long-winded way of going down it, but I think that there's just tremendous opportunity for us to become like the training system for the Department of Defense from hire all the way to retire, and it gets me pumped.
That's freaking great, Sasha. I love it. Well, thanks so much for joining. If folks want to contact you for assistance or see what you're doing, how's the best way to follow, what Ethos is doing?
Yeah, so you can contact me directly on LinkedIn, just Sasha Seymore. You can also visit our website, ethossystems.com with 2 S's. And yeah, I really appreciate you having me on the pod.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to meeting you in person, and I'll keep following because this is great. So thanks so much, and let's stay in touch.
Cool. Thanks, David. See you, brother.